Hello and good evening, everybody. This is Ritesh Kumar, partner Indus Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Shashi Matthews, who's also a partner with our tax practice at Indus Law. A very warm welcome to all of you on this session hosted with Economic Times around the recent union budget announced by the government of India. The union budget, as many of us will know, has been announced amidst a pandemic of the sorts that we've not seen in the many years. Luckily for us, India has been strong, as has been the economic recovery in India. There has also been a very comfortable position insofar as various statistics around the COVID-19 pandemic are concerned. And amidst this pandemic, announcing a budget like this, which is very reformative, lays out the path for future policy, recognition of the fact that encouragement to businesses has to be provided by increasing the opportunities rather than just doling out incentives and tax incentives. A bold move during these uncertain times. It, I'm sure, is very difficult to resist the temptation of increasing revenue by creating incremental taxes. But all credit and support goes to our finance minister, who has been able to successfully pull this off. And with that little pretext, I'd like to thank Economic Times for hosting this particular panel session. And with this, I'm going to quickly invite our panelists onto this webinar. First, we have with us Mr. Arun Ramachandran. Arun Ramachandran is the head of tax with Tata Consumer Products, a chartered accountant by profession, and over close to 2 decades of experience in tax advisory and tax leadership roles in the industry. Arun, welcome. Good evening.
Thank you, Ritesh. I'm glad to be on the session.
We now have Mr. Sanjeev Agarwal, who is the head of tax and custom controls at BMW India. Someone who's seen this industry and the tax function grow through many years with his experience and the kind of expertise that he has. We very warmly welcome Mr. Sanjeev Agarwal on this panel this evening. Sanjeev, good evening.
Good evening, Ritesh. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you, Sanjeev. We now have Mr. Varun Raj Khanna, who leads the tax function at Airtel, Bharti Airtel, comes again with a very diverse experience. He's seen enough on the litigation side. He's seen enough on the business emergence side. And again, someone with over 15 years of experience in this role of tax itself. Welcome, Varun. Welcome to this panel.
Thanks a lot, Ritesh and Shashi. Thanks for ET to having me over.
Now we have Mr. Lakshmi Shah, who joins us from PhonePe. He's the head of tax at PhonePe. Lakshmi Shah is also a chartered accountant with close to 15 years of experience in tax. Before joining PhonePe, he was a director with PwC. And like I said, he's now head of tax at PhonePe. He, has his specializations with transactions, in the transactions tax domain. But now, he does handle a broad range of tax issues with PhonePe. Welcome, Lakshmi Shah. Welcome to this panel. Good evening.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Look forward to this session.
Thank you, Lakshmi Shah. With this, with this round of introductions and the context we set out, the way we are going to host this panel today is we propose to spend roughly 15 minutes on decoding the details of the Finance Bill 2021 with a very quick overview on the policies and the direction that our finance minister has shown us in this budget. After we finish the presentation for the first 10 or 15 minutes, we will then, open up the discussion with the panel. We do hope to get a lot of insight from an industry perspective from a panel of this kind. We have, participation from FMCG, the new age digital technology, telecommunication, automobiles, so we have a very broad and a very and a very experienced panel with us. So we'll devote roughly 30 minutes of our time in panel discussion, and then we'll open up the forum for any public Q&As. We have a moderator along with us who will help us do that session. So with that, with that understanding on the flow of how this event will progress, we'll quickly run into the budget presentation that we had. Needless to say, but the quick background of, or rather the quick backdrop of the economy when the budget is being presented this time, we've seen that the GDP has contracted severely. It did contract at about close to 24% in the first quarter of this financial year, but soon enough recovered to only have a contraction of 7.5% in the second quarter. Hopefully, the results of the third quarter and fourth quarter will also be as encouraging. Recent statistics tell us that our GST collections have gone up substantially to touch the 1.2 lakh crore mark, which is a very welcome data to get. The finance minister said that we expect the fiscal deficit to be at a 9.5% of the GDP, and which will contract down to 6.5 or 7% in the coming financial year. This is also a very positive direction that our finance minister has shown us, because none of us expected such a sharp recovery on the GDP, especially given the kind of economic hit that most countries in the globe have taken. We are expecting a pre-inflation growth of 15.4%, which means net of inflation, we are expected to grow the real growth at 11%, which is also a very positive outlook and a very positive growth direction that we are shown. Needless to say, this budget, beyond anything else, has laid out some policy announcements which were unprecedented in the form and the vastness of which they were delivered. It is not just focused on a certain pockets of the country. The policy announcements are broad ranged and they cover pretty much every sector in India today, from infrastructure being roads, railways, metro rails, portways, to automotive, to startups. There is a whole host of reforms or liberalization in some form that has now been announced. These are extremely welcome moves. The direction shown to us is that we will make the country business friendly, and then it is the entrepreneurs of this country who will have to stitch together the spirit and make this a successful ecosystem. A very welcome and a very heart-touching move that our finance minister has done. Most relevant of all, if you ask us in our judgment and opinion, is setting up of a bad bank, essentially where you are now de-stressing the balance sheets of nationalized banks today by hiving off the stressed assets into a separate asset reconstruction company or an asset management company, which will then take further recourse on how recoveries and how the collections from those assets have to be made. Coupled with the recapitalization of 20,000 crores in banks, I think this is going to sort of, in some sense, obviously revamp the balance sheet of the banks and also therefore allow them further leverage and breathing space to do the day-to-day activities. The second on that side is, the commitment to the IFSC, not just the development of the world-class fintech center, the promise that the finance minister has made, but also interestingly, the kind of tax relaxations that are now being proposed for businesses that either set up in the IFSC or that relocate into the IFSC, especially in the financial services space. So that those are really outstanding moves, and these have the potential to sort of reinvent India in the form of financial services hub, especially in the region of Asia. The other significant announcement was around the divestments. Though some of us did express our immediate doubts on how divestments will be completed by FY 2022, but the divestment plan that has now been rolled out, along with the strong commitment by demonstrating legislative amendments to the LIC Act to enable the IPO of LIC, I think those are the kind of that's the kind of commitment and direction that we've always wanted from the government, because this is, just about the right kind of shot in the arm that we all wanted to see to sort of revive the economic growth or the economic activity at some level. So That again, a very welcome move in the way we see it. Introducing a permanent e-court system, be it for the National Company Law Tribunal or the Income Tax Appellate Tribunal, and thinking of setting up at least of the alternate dispute resolution methods when it comes to contractual disputes and for MSMEs. This is fantastic, right? Because then what you're doing is you're making the system a lot more efficient, a lot more transparent, and a lot more convenient to be accessed. And these are, like I've kept saying in this last few minutes, these are just the kind of things that we were hoping we will get direction on. So all in all, from a policy perspective, there is a huge push. There is a huge recognition for the need of change, and that change is now coming through for us. The success of these will, needless to say, the success of this announcements will definitely lie in how the policy measures get implemented. But directionally, I think a very, very welcome budget that has been presented. Quickly on the direct tax side, there were a whole host of amendments, a long list of them actually speaking. But very quickly, in terms of personal income tax matters, we are not seeing any rate change for individuals. Unlike most people suspected, the finance minister has not proposed any rate change whatsoever. No COVID says, no incremental says to sort of match the shortfall in the revenue collections on the direct tax side. Of course, there has also therefore been no enhancement to the investment limits under Section 80C and 80D of the Income Tax Act. This kind of a move definitely does sort of make you think, was this an opportunity missed? Because, something like enhancing the limits of 80C could have possibly given rise to channelizing domestic savings, and those domestic savings being converted into capital deployed, I think could have had a multiplier effect. But, having said that, for the best judgment of our FM, I think this has not happened. There is a exemption equivalent provided for long-term, for the leave encashment regime that has now been proposed. There is interestingly moved to now tax interest earned by a provident fund contributor, an employee contributing into provident fund. Interest earned by him will be taxable if the contribution made into the PF account exceed 250,000 rupees. This move, while most of us don't really follow, but as has now been clarified, has been made on the principles of economic parity. So to say that, there should not be a disparity between so to say that, a rich can afford it, the people who are making nominal contributions must still enjoy exemption. Similarly, also when it comes to taxation of ULIPs, if the ULIP premium exceeds 250,000 rupees, the ULIP proceeds are not tax exempt. They will be subject to tax. The respite, of course, here is that the ULIP proceeds will be taxed as capital gains and not as any other income, which means your effective rate of tax could be much lower if this is a long-term holding that you have, and could effectively be as, at 20%, as opposed to having to be at 34 or 43%, depending on what tax slabs individually we all fall into. Having said that, on the personal side, couple of quick interesting amendments on the corporate tax side. There is a proposal to have a permanent disallowance if a corporate entity fails to discharge the social security contributions received from employees into the credit of the employee social security account within the stipulated timelines. So if, for example, company A employs Mr. B as an employee and collects rupees 12,500 as a contribution towards PF and deposits this 12,500 rupees after the due date of the PF deposit, then the company who has delayed the deposit into the PF account will be liable to tax at the rate of 12,500, at the applicable corporate tax rates on the 12,500 rupees that it has collected from the employee. Earlier, the position was that so long as the amounts got deposited, even if it was delayed, relying on certain judgments of the High Court, one took a view that such a 12,500 rupees should not be taxable. Now that position entirely changes. The second such interesting amendment, which is now proposed into the corporate tax regime, is that goodwill of any form will not be considered as tax depreciable. Essentially, consider a situation where in a transaction, the acquirer has paid rupees 1,000 as the purchase consideration, and the net asset value of the assets which are transferred pursuant to the acquisition only represent rupees 700. The differential between 1,000 and 700, rupees 300 was represented as a goodwill in the books of the acquirer, and a view emerged basis the Supreme Court's decision in the Smith Securities matter that the 300 shall be entitled for depreciation at an applicable rate of 25%. The Supreme Court did consider a blanket judgment in a one-page said that any goodwill shall be depreciable. The final nuance of that was, however, whether the goodwill represents a commercial right. Are there any business advantages that come along when you acquire such a goodwill? Those questions remained open, and now the Finance Bill proposes to entirely reverse the position. The fear here being that the amendment seems to be made alongside the date of 1st April 1998. So really a little bit of concern around whether this will be retrospective or retroactive in its applicability. Certain amendments as regards to clarifying definitions and making amendments to the MAT regime have also now been carried out. Again, the other interesting part is how you look at taxing slump exchange, a form of transaction where a business undertaking was sold for non-cash consideration. This again, high courts, especially in the leading matter of Bharat Bijli, high courts had taken the view that an exchange of business undertaking for a consideration being non-cash will not be taxable. So now the views seemingly reversed by the proposals in the Finance Bill. There is a deeming fiction introduced for demergers, which essentially allow restructuring of PSUs by hiving off land parcels or monetizable assets into an SPV, for which there is a deeming notion of demerger that is now being defined under the income tax law. And that deemed demerger will enjoy tax exemption, carry forward of losses, and amendments are now being made to the Indian stamp duty law to even exempt such deemed demergers from stamp duty. Quick amendments have also been made on the equalization levy. There have been some clarifying, definitions now introduced. The scope of royalty and FTS has now been kept outside of the purview of the equalization levy, and to some extent, the exemption from income tax has now been clarified to be applicable from the 1st of April 2020. The other interesting part, speaking of tax dispute resolution and borrowing from the speech of the finance minister, she announced that the reassessment proceedings, the time limit of which will be capped to 3 years. As we read through the details of the finance bill, we've understood that it is not just the time limits which are being capped, it is the whole reassessment process that is now being revisited to come up with a new process which will allow reassessment. Essentially, therefore, if the income escaping tax from is in excess of 50 lakh rupees, then reassessment can be carried out for up to 10 years and not just restricted to 3 years. The 3 years restriction is only if income escaping assessment is below the 50 lakhs threshold. There are changes made to the process of the advance ruling. There is changes made to the time limit for completion of assessments, etc. But those are more procedural. There is a very interesting proposal to double the rate of TDS and TCS if the person receiving the payment has not been filing tax returns in India. So that's a very interesting move to ensure that adequate and sufficient tax returns are filed. Like I said, a whole host of incentives for units operating in IFSC. And most interestingly, an incentive now provided to offshore funds who operate out of typically Singapore or Mauritius to now relocate themselves into the IFSC. And the entire process of relocation now enjoys a full tax exemption. That's a very interesting stimulus or boost to setting up in the IFSC. With this, quickly, Shashi, would you want to just walk through the indirect tax changes?
Thanks, Ritesh. So, as Ritesh pointed out, the budget has given a direction for the economy after the COVID pandemic and the lockdowns that have happened. Over the last few years, the government has focused on Make in India initiatives, digitizing the economy, and most of the changes on the indirect tax side seem to be a push towards incentivizing production in India. And we see that from the rate changes. The government could have gone ahead with increasing the customs rates. They did that in some cases where they wanted to push the domestic industry to produce these items. Broadly, from a GST perspective, as you can see, there are changes which have happened to the definition of supply. The scope of supply itself has been widened. From a business perspective, I think most businesses welcome this move of there being no GST audit and us moving to a self-certification regime on those lines. And to give certainty to business, and that's what we've been discussing also. A lot of the amendments have come, reducing timelines. So to some extent, reducing the pressure of litigation on businesses is what the government is looking at, and that's something that we'll have a discussion on going forward. But so from that perspective, GST has had some changes. There have been some interesting changes in customs, including the Common Customs Portal, which is expected to be on the lines of the GST portal. And from a digitizing perspective, from a certain ease of doing business perspective, the customs portal is expected to be a dashboard for businesses. That is one change that has been done. The government introduced the AIDC, the Agricultural Infrastructure Development Cess. Interestingly, what the government did there was by reducing the customs duty rates on those items and bringing in the AIDC on those items like alcohol, where at the end of the day, the consumer doesn't get affected. So that is an interesting proposal that I see. From a broad macro perspective, this is what the changes in IDT were. So let's just see, again, as I said, there's a conditional exemption notification that have been given a timeline now for 2 years. And I think businesses will now be able to plan their activities going forward in a better manner. So from that, I think what we can do, Ritesh, is open up the panel for discussion and take it forward from there.
Sure. Shashi, I think it's a good idea. Of course, I think just given the kind of changes and the number of changes that they are, if you allow some of us, we may go on for a couple of hours. But in the interest of the session, Arun, I'd like to begin with you quickly. We've seen a TCS regime introduced in the last finance bill, and we said 0.1% on sale of goods. Now that seems to have reversed entirely to be TDS on purchase of goods. The rate is the same, so I suppose cash flow is not an issue. But what's your view on this? The entire change in process. How easy or difficult do you think this is going to be?
So, firstly, rightly mentioned that the budget, in terms of budget, it's a big. There was no increase in tax rates. I'm sure there was a temptation, though. If I'm in the post-budget speech and press release, there was a mention that there was COVID cess was never contemplated. I'm glad to hear that. But yeah, overall, it's a good budget. No tax rate increases. As far as the TDS amendment, the way it comes across, it is a bit of a dampener to a budget in a budget which is generally positive. It's a dampener more from the burden of compliance and ease of doing business. Though it sounds very simple in terms of shift from a tax collected at source regime to a tax deduction at source. The person undertaking the compliance and the person collecting the tax is different. Though it sounds very simple in a transaction, but the shift by itself is quite complicated. It's quite a big shift. Now, the genesis, given the tax rate or the TCS rate and TDS rate, the genesis has been data collection. So what the government is trying to achieve with this is to collect data of of the transactions, which is otherwise available in GST returns and GST forms, though we keep hearing about data exchange between CBIC and CBDT, that doesn't seem to be happening. So hence we see provisions like TCS and TDS at a transaction level. There are three issues with this amendment that I see. One, TCS was introduced effective 1st April 2020, though it was introduced in the Finance Bill 2020. It was effective from 1st October 2020. It lasted, the way it looks, it has lasted only 9 months. For a system that the kind of configuration every ERP system had to go through to implement a complex TCS provision, take positions on discounts, take position on sales returns, how do you offset TCS and account for TCS credit, how do you carry out TCS reconciliation? Personally, it is a bit of a heartburn to see that last only 9 months. The feeling you get also is a bit of a trial and error. Okay, TCS doesn't work, let's move to TDS regime. So that's a bit of a concern from a policy stability standpoint. The other issue which I see is the way the drafting has been done. It is not a simple substitution of TDS, on transactions where TCS applies. So the way the drafting has been done in the law, there is a case of coexistence of both TCS provisions and TDS provisions, especially in transactions where TDS is not applicable. So TDS is, as per the provision that has been brought in, TDS is applicable if the turnover of the buyer exceeds a certain threshold. If it doesn't exceed the threshold, then the onus is still on the seller to collect TCS if the transactions between the buyer and seller exceeds 50 lakhs. So that's going to lead to a lot of confusion. As a seller, I wait to see if the buyer is going to direct TDS or not, and then go ahead and do a TCS compliance, which is a bit of a concern.
Correct.
There
and also, yeah,
issue in terms of cutover. When you switch over from a TCS to TDS regime, you'll have transactions or some cutover date. You're struggling to figure out whether it be subject to TCS or subject to TDS or subject to both. So that's another area of concern. Of course, that is more a transitional issue. By and large, it is going to be a humongous effort again to flip your systems, ERP systems, to a TDS regime, move away from the TCS regime, which has just lasted 9 months. Yes, we don't see, though it comes across as a simple shift, it is a big change in terms of compliance.
right. And the interesting part is I don't understand how will a corporate maintain a vendor data. How will you bifurcate turnover? Would you do it year on year? Would you do some form of a self-certification saying I'm not exceeding 10 crores? How do you maintain that kind of information for you to be compliant?
That's going to be a challenge, both in the provision, this provision, and the TDS amendment of doubling the rate where tax returns are not filed by the vendors. So at this point, I'm not sure if there's a system to verify the data. So that's going to be a challenge. I've heard a couple of press notes or press quoting the CBDT chairman saying that like GST, now you can be able to see whether based on PAN that a particular taxpayer has filed returns or not. So that's still to be made available. We'll wait for the system to evolve. But the expectation seems to be that the detector verifies the tax compliance of the ecosystem, the vendors you deal with, the customers you deal with. So as a responsible tax system, the onus is now not on the tax office, but with each business entity to vouch for the ecosystem's tax compliance.
You're an onerous agent, Arun. That's all I can tell you at the end of it.
Onerous carry agent.
Yeah.
Right. There's another question that we have received. This is on equalization levy, and I think I'll put it to Lakshmisha. What is your view on on what constitutes online sale of goods? Do you think the proposed definition does justice to the issues raised by the industry in the past?
I can see the grin, Lakshmisha.
equalization levy itself, I think, should be only questions and not answers over there. So if you look at how they introduced the equalization levy, I think the government intended first to come up with significant economic presence and taxation thereof. But because of the large change in the way taxation occurs and how to track, they came up with a via media last year while pushing the significant economic presence, telling we'll charge equalization levy for anything that is bought online from India. So any online person selling anything from across the world will tax it in India if an Indian person buys or if an Indian IP address is used. So this, I think, goes in line with the whole digital taxation phenomena that is being discussed all over the world. And India was not the only country trying to do this. There are enough European countries, Australia and others also trying to do this, but each one at a different stage and trying to levy tax on a different thing. Now, if you look at India, I think the bigger concern for every taxpayer, although most of them want to comply with tax laws across the globe while running their business, was how the definition was in terms of any person who had an online presence from whom an Indian company either purchased directly or indirectly would have to pay equalization levy in India. Two, the online presence did not mean that the entire ecosystem of placing a purchase to delivery is handled by that person. It can just mean any of the legs of the whole transaction. For example, a company just having a website to market its product, and if it receives an inquiry today, then that gets caught by the definition as we see today. Because in the amendment, if you look at it, they have told if you accept the sale, or if the purchase order is placed online, or if there's an acceptance of the purchase order online, or if a payment is made online. So then I think even sending an email for a purchase could probably get covered under this. For example, if I'm just buying a machine, then I think the person who is supplying, who earlier would not have been taxable in India because he does not have any presence in India, then he could become taxable here. So this creates a lot of confusion and chaos. Even if we looked at what the industry had asked the government to clarify was what part of the transaction is taxed? Should the entire ecosystem be there, or me just having a website and getting a customer through the website creates this? Two, this is more relevant for a lot of the search engines and platforms, which today act as e-commerce platform to sell goods or services. If you look at it, one of the second amendments that they have come up with is what is the value on which you pay the tax, okay, or the consideration. Ideally, it should be the income which I earn. On that, if I pay tax, then that is what is equitable. But now we look at it, it talks about the consideration of goods and services that is bought or sold. So for a search engine which earns a commission from a sale of a product or by someone clicking a link to go to some other website to buy a product, for example, if a product is sold is of 100 and he earns 1 rupee, he is required to pay equalization levy of 2 rupees, which is 2% of 100. So somewhere this, I think some of these aspects still needs to be clarified. And also the entire definition of how they've defined an online portal. Because just by having a website or creating a purchase order online, I don't think there should be an equalization levy on this. There should be a little more substance to this to get what an Indian customer is paying from India for the service or the goods being used in India. For example, OTT platforms. I think that's a good case because the entire economic value is coming out of India with a person sitting outside. That I think the whole consideration part makes sense. But I think they'll have to look at it industry-wise and category-wise to come up with a holistic answer to this. And also with the significant economic presence provisions becoming applicable from 1st April, the interplay between these two also becomes very important.
Correct. And interestingly, after the Delhi High Court matter on equalization levy in some form, we were hoping that there is some respite, or at least if you have a permanent establishment, if you have some form of a transfer pricing arrangement, but nothing seems to have found its way here. And to my mind, the rudest surprise was that they said we'll exclude royalty and FTS from the scope of equalization levy, which means that on a software transaction, the least you will collect is 2% of equalization levy, the most you will collect is 10% pending the Supreme Court's judgment on this matter. So you've essentially created a win-win, right?
Yeah. So I think that's the most controversial amendment that they have come up with, telling it
Yeah.
taxed under the act or the treaty. If it is going exempt under the treaty, then you pay equalization.
Correct. And that's very odd because for a tax assessment to happen in India, the 2% you paid, will it be credited, not credited? Those are again gray areas, right? And Sanjeev, I know this topic is dear to you, it's closer to your heart. Any remark on this, Sanjeev?
Yeah, sure. So of course, the clarification with regard to royalty is welcome. At least there is some certainty around it. But as Lakshmi Shah has also mentioned, that if goods are bought, if the goods are bought by a company from, let's say, let's talk about a practical scenario of a white goods manufacturing entity in India, and if they are buying some spare parts or some parts to produce the goods in India from their affiliates in overseas, then will that should that get taxed under equalization levy merely because they are using some integrated application to
Correct.
order the goods? So to my sense, it should not get covered. But the way the law is written, one is compelled to think more into the details. And these integrated applications are used merely to fasten the supply chain and to sort of say that these just-in-time supply kind of situations. So this equalization levy is really a serious matter, and it's 2%. It's not a small amount. So 2% of the transaction value is a lot, especially when some companies may not even have that kind of margin when they sell. So it's really a cause of concern.
You're right. Perhaps we should go back to writing letters on a lighter note. But quickly, taking this conversation further, clearly compliances and data and all of that we are speaking about. Varun, I'm very tempted to ask you, they've removed the GST audit requirement. They've in that sense eased compliance. As a tax leader, what's your view on this? Does this ease your compliance? Does it sort of, what's your general take on this?
So I think the requirement of easing out the auditor's certification for the annual returns is a welcome move. Having an external auditor for the smaller taxpayers was definitely a constraint. I mean, in the sense that you had to go out and engage yet another party and come in. Putting more onus on the taxpayer is a good idea because it's self-certification. So the person is that much more responsible for what they're putting out. I mean, the monthly returns are in any case on a self-certification basis. Simply having a stamp of an auditor doesn't improve or worsen things. The government's recognizing that. I think the what remains to be seen is, as always, the devil lies in the details. So we'll have to see what kind of self-certification they're proposing. But for the most part, to the extent it stops or it doesn't mandate a taxpayer, especially the smaller taxpayers, to go out and seek an auditor report. It's still possible for a taxpayer to go and still meet their auditor to instead of having a formal audit report, help out the taxpayer in upfront determining discrepancies and resolving them. So voluntary compliance is not done away with in any formal manner. So I think for the most part, it's a positive move. I actually see it as speeding things up.
Sort of keeps you on your toes since there is no audit happening otherwise.
Absolutely.
Right. Sanjeev, just, as a customs expert, I really want to ask you this question. Though there have not been major changes in the customs rates, do you think the changes which have been sort of brought in right now, is that for incentivizing domestic procurement? What is the idea? What is your views on this?
Yeah, Shashi. So in general, the first reaction to increase in customs duty is that the government is, protecting the domestic industry. But first of all, let's acknowledge that there has been reduction in customs duty as well on certain parts. I guess it's largely on the steel-based imports. The customs duty has been reduced. So one has to understand that move of government is taken to protect the interest of users, steel users in India, because of the supply demand situation. So this actually clearly demonstrates that the government is not simply interested in protecting the local domestic industry, but they are also keen to make sure to protect the interest of steel users, so that because of imbalance in demand and supply situation, the the raw material shouldn't become more expensive. So that's one aspect of it. But let's talk about when the customs duty is increased in certain areas. So what I understand is, if we connect this with the Atmanirbhar Bharat scheme of Government of India, my sense is that the increase of 7.5%, 10% to 15% will encourage local production. Of course, it will, and we have to wait and watch how this PLI scheme comes up. The industry is keenly waiting for that. To see this whole situation together, of course, domestic industry will have some sort of encouragement to produce locally. But my sense is that unless India becomes truly self-reliant and competitive on such items, till that time there could be a sense of temporary adverse impact on the supply chain, and people will have to buy either expensive parts, or they may have to wait and watch until the complete local production happens, domestic production happens. So this has to be seen a little bit cautiously from the business continuity perspective. And lastly, I would also like to make a comment that, of course, the domestic manufacturing can be set up, but in certain areas, when the local company is heavily based on imports, and the quantity of those inputs is also not, the volume is not that enough to produce locally, then there is no incentive to produce locally, right? So what I'm trying to say is, even if you start putting a factory with a lower volume of goods in India, it's not going to yield you, productive result. So that could also be one of the challenges. So volume could, destroy the whole game as well.
I think that is a really interesting perspective that you have given, because the idea behind a scheme like PLI was to focus on those areas like, in the electronic sector, to make India manufacturing up for that. But a very important point that you make is that where the low value items, or in terms of quantity also, there isn't much that is required, then you necessarily have to import those. I think one important shift that we've seen over the last few years, we've been a major service exporter. And now I think the idea is also to make us a major goods exporter. And that is a keen push that the government is doing. So yeah, thank you for your input, Sanjeev.
Yeah.
Ritesh, anything that you want to take on?
No, I think if you look at it directionally, they've also in the previous occasion liberalized a regime for setting up new manufacturing plants under the income tax law. They've offered a much attractive 15% rate of tax. I think the direction, like Sanjeev pointed out, is to create that self-reliance, right? The Atmanirbharta that we've been talking about, plus also to offer a second choice to the global economy in terms of creating a manufacturing hub. So far, China has been the predominant one. Do we really make India the second option that the world can look to? So I think that's the sense of direction if you sort of aggregate the changes in the last year entirely. So that's where I'm seeing this go. Interesting point, in the last 4 days has also been on withdrawal of depreciation on goodwill. And I know that, people who often do transactions while tax does not drive your decision to do the deal, it does impact the quality and the sweetness in the deal. I'm sort of tempted to ask this question to two people, but Varun, would you go first? And and then I'm definitely going to wait to hear Lakshmi Shah's thought on this.
Sure. So I think it's it's been a long drawn out litigation that the department has been doing for some time, and thanks to the Supreme Court judgment in Smith Securities, depreciation on goodwill was being claimed by the taxpayer and being granted for the most part on the ground. Although there were cases where the department still disputing it, and at the assessment level itself, this was being denied, and then litigation was continuing. They've now confirmed, by removing it from the block of assets, it's clearly denied. Will it impact deals? I don't think it will impact deals, Ritesh. Will it impact the economics of a deal? Absolutely.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, that's where we were at.
But given the overall number of elements impacting the economics of a deal, which is valuation of the business for the most part, the future earnings capacity, the quality of the assets being transferred, just depreciation on goodwill plays a part, but I wouldn't say it plays an overriding part in the overall economics. Where I do see a concern, however, is that the change is proposed to be retrospective from April 1, 2020. Okay, and therefore it impacts deals that have already been concluded.
Correct.
Where you've got this already in place, the buyer and the seller will agree on a certain pricing and factor this into whatever form and manner they believe to be relevant in the deal economics. It's a commercial matter now. All right. End of the day, you still have to pay tax. You factor in tax in some form and manner. The tax cost suddenly just increase now because depreciation on goodwill is no longer available. But where deals have been concluded and have been predicated on the fact that depreciation goodwill will be available, I think to that extent, it's a bit of a dampener on sentiment. And it goes against the general grain of this government saying that retrospective changes will not be brought in.
Correct. You're right. You're right. This government was very vocal about it.
Correct. And to the most part, they've held their ground on that aspect as well. But to the extent it's for last 10 months, yes. But overall, going forward, there is some protection, limited albeit, to the fact that if you acquire goodwill and you subsequently sell that business, the acquired goodwill will be part of your cost of acquisition for determining any capital gains that arises. So so it's a timing difference only. It's not a permanent difference. It becomes a permanent difference, however, wherever you buy a business without the intention of reselling, which I imagine would be the predominant element of where you would do a transaction. I mean, other than PE funds, even PE funds would buy into a company, but you don't buy a business with a desired objective of reselling it.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, predominantly when you've done business transfers, you house the business for long enough to be a permanent difference.
Exactly.
Lakshmi Shah, your views on this and M&A generally?
So on goodwill aspect itself, I think one aspect which could be relooked at is what happens to goodwill which you have actually paid for. So there are two aspects in the whole goodwill thing, right? One is when you buy a business and you have actually paid cash consideration and you allocate some of that consideration to all your assets and the balance to goodwill. Somewhere that is actually a paid goodwill, which could have been looked at for depreciation because that's a purchase price that has been incurred. Okay, for an intangible which is not seen by anyone, but for the business as a whole itself. So that's one consideration that I think needs a relook because it's a purchase price being paid as against something in a merger or a demerger which arises where you swap shares and you have created goodwill because of that by valuing all the assets and liabilities that you have taken over at fair value and the balance going to goodwill. Over there, it's not an acquired goodwill or a paid for goodwill, but more because of an accounting entry and the manner you pass the accounting entries, you create a goodwill for the difference of shares issued to the net worth that you have taken over. So this, I think, was a gray area, and like how Varun referred to it before Smith Securities, I think everyone was taking a position not available. Smith Securities gave that leeway and created some bit of grayness to start claiming depreciation on this. which rightly I think has been covered to tell that this should not be available because this is not paid goodwill, and most of the other sections of the act also supported this whole thing. So that slump sale aspect where you've actually acquired and paid for should be something that the government has looked at. From a deal perspective, I think the pricing of the deal will now need to be relooked into, because one of the key aspects of getting a deduction for the entire purchase price goes away now. So whatever goes to goodwill will only become, you'll get a deduction only when you actually sell the business in future and not at any other time. The second aspect is the retrospectivity, which Varun covered. Along with the retrospective effect from 1st April of 2020, they also mentioned that whatever goodwill is there in the books, which has been created in the past because of M&A, that will have to be treated as a short-term capital gains, and rules will come to that. So does that mean that everyone who has goodwill from M&A in the past pay tax now in this year? That's something that needs to be seen on how the rules come up with and what happens. And we are almost at the fag end of the year now. So if you have to pay tax in the year FY21, that could become a big concern for the industry as a whole.
Right. And on slump exchange, Lakshmishab, if you look at the amendment that has been brought in, it definitely does not stop at slump exchange, right? Especially the kind of background that has been given in the memorandum, a deemed kind of a transfer represented by a slump, represented as a slump sale. I think that's, in my mind, I'm slightly wary of a broad definition of that kind, not more because of the immediate income tax issues, but very often in deals we prefer not to do slump sale because you don't want to inherit certain unknown liabilities that come along with it. And under tax circumstances, let it be section 170, the provisions around succession into business, commercially, legally, various liabilities, right? What's your view on this? Because I'm particularly not very sure if this will play out only to the extent they want it to.
So now I think the slump exchange definition gets linked to the entire transfer or any deemed transfer.
Correct.
So it gives the tax authorities free hand in determining if a transaction is actually a slump sale, even if you have split the consideration of a business and bought individual assets.
Correct.
Which defeats the whole purpose of getting the slump sale taxation by the government, to give the taxpayer the option of either going under a slump sale route where you pay taxes, capital gains tax, or in the normal transfer route. So that now I think will lead to some litigation at the tax payer end, because even if he chooses a normal asset sale, someone could come and tell, no, this was the entire business being brought, so this should be treated as a slump sale. And from a buyer's perspective also, if you had paid piecemeal to every asset, they could still relook at and start reallocating the values that he has allocated for. Okay.
Right.
So overall, I think while they're trying to include exchange, the deemed portion of it is creating a lot of confusion.
Correct.
And even on exchange, how do you calculate the consideration? Again, whether you go back to general principles of fair valuation or how do you do it, that's something which will cause some concern in the near future.
Yeah, so just going to GST side a bit, Arun, I have a very interesting question for you. We've waited a while for the matching provisions to finally kick in. There was a lot of back and forth on this. Finally, it seems to be making an entry, at least on the ITC side. What is your view on it, and what do you think happens to 36(4) right now, going forward?
Like you said, we've been expecting this. The government has been graceful by only bringing it after 3 years of GST. So that way, it's a relief. Having said that, okay, let me take a step back and, for the interest of the viewers, walk through the rules 36 and section 16. So section 16 of the CGST Act has been amended to introduce input credit matching. On the contrary, Rule 36(4) allows a leeway of variance up to 5%. What it means is, if your input credits are matching to the tune of 95% or more, you're allowed to claim the input credit that you have as per your records. Now, with the amendment to Section 16 of CGST Act, essentially one need to wait and see what happens to Rule 36(4). But going by the general idea of Act overriding the rule being more administrative, it looks like the intention is to make it absolute match without any legroom or leeway for non-compliance. Like I said, it's not a surprise. This was expected. And it goes with the overall theme of keep your ecosystem compliant, make sure your vendors are compliant, make sure your customers are compliant. It goes with that ecosystem. The challenge I see is doing too many things in too little time. We've introduced e-invoicing. Invoicing was introduced effective 1st October for companies above 500 crores turnover and 100 crores from effective 1st Jan. Of course, the GST collections have gone up, so it is driving compliance. So that's whatever government is trying to do by increasing the compliance burden is actually making sure the tax collections are going up. So there seems to be a good success rate that way. But the concern is with doing too many things in too little time, the industry may not be ready. So we are certain to see that that reporting doesn't happen. We are certain to see that there will be some non-compliant vendors. So is this the right way to deal with bad apples? We always would have bad apples. Is this the right way to deal with bad apples by increasing the compliance burden? So that's something we'll have to wait and watch. Time will only answer this.
On the same lines, Varun, I would like to put this. What are your views on the matching provisions? Because I'm very keen to know your side of the story.
Sure. So, I mean, I think as Arun mentioned that there's been a change in Section 16 and therefore to some extent it works at cross purposes to the rule. I think what they've effectively done by what this virtue of change in law is they've given legal sanctity to the GSTR 2A. Okay, which if you look at the original scheme of the Act, there was a legal sanctity because Section 37, 38, 39 were notified. So there was a sanctity to GSTR 2 and GSTR 3, which have been, deferred sine die. 3B was brought in and given sanctity again by a retrospective amendment, but there was nothing on 2A. What this change has done is given a sanctity to the information provided in 2A. Okay, and what they're saying is that if your name figures in 2A, we'll consider the tax to have been paid. What it still leaves open is that tax is paid as per 3B, and 2A is a mirror image of GSTR 1. Therefore, is the government or are the tax authorities kind of deeming that we will take care of the difference between GSTR 1 and 3B? You take care of 3B as a taxpayer or as a large corporate. So I think it opens up these questions, which will have its own, they'll run their own course. Section 16 and 36(4), in my view, are always at cross purposes to each other. Initially, 36(4) was giving a leeway. Okay. Today, that leeway is definitely gone. So I see that once this change in Section 16 gets notified, and it'll take at least a year because they'll get notified once all the state legislatures pass the law in their respective SGST Acts or the UT GST Acts. 36(4) will die. Okay. The moot point will still remain that if, like Arun mentioned, there'll be some bad apples. So if some vendors have taken the tax away from me as a more compliant taxpayer and have not paid it, should that credit still be denied? All right. I think that question is still open. But yes, at least there's certainty that this matching principle, which the government has been trying to bring in since day one, is now there in the open.
Interesting. And, on this note, Varun, I'm tempted to draw some form of a feeling or a common base theme that data is still going to be driving a lot of the in-house tax functions, right? In terms of making compliances, going through audits, investigations, and scrutinies. And to that extent, therefore, do you have any comments on What's your perspective on these timeline changes? How really do these timeline changes play out? Because you have about 3 years to finish a GST investigation. You have customs with a similar timeline. So how do you read all of this situation, Varun? And then, of course, we'd love to hear from Sanjeev on this also.
Timelines in income tax are far more stringent than in the case of GST. So I see them fairly liberal in GST, and I see that with the data, to the extent there is, the number of inquiries that are coming in GST, and there is a lot of exchange of data between income tax and GST going on. The DGARM is very, very active, and it's populating data. Perhaps, we often say the tax office knows more about you than you know about yourself, because they're collecting data from multiple sources, whereas in a corporate you might be siloed in one kind of tax or one kind of report that you're visiting. So there is a lot of integration out there. So I don't see why these timelines shouldn't get kind of synchronized. And I hope that somewhere down the future, you'll actually have a common audit saying that for this a particular entity, if it's chosen for audit, do a singular audit between encompassing tax and GST. I mean, you already have it in investigations, right? The moment there's a fake invoice issue, that entity is being investigated not only for GST, but for GST, income tax, and potentially customs as well. The penal provisions in the 3 laws for fake invoices, for instance, and this is, at the end of the day, all this data is more garnered towards preventing frauds and catching a tax evader than perhaps a tax compliant entity.
Correct. Sanjeev, would you want to chip in here? What's your view? I mean, I would be concerned for the 5 years because I'll have to then obligatory maintain data for that long. But your thoughts, Sanjeev?
Yeah, sure. I will do that. But before I answer that, I'll just connect what Varun said. So Varun said, and each one of us know that government has much more data than what we think at times. So this is my wish list on a lighter side, that when I will see that day when we don't have to file tax return. If government has everything, then what is the need of filing tax returns?
You're right. At least the pre-filling of income tax is starting now. So
yeah, pre-filling. So they can fill it everything. If they have such a good amount of data. But anyways, so So as far as the new timelines for reassessment and investigation is concerned, so it's a welcome move. Now from 6 years, it has come down to 3 years. And it is certainly going to reduce the litigation and provide ease of doing business in India. It's a big comfort and very welcome move. And, of course, sometimes people think that how to maintain data for 3 years, 6 years, or maybe in some extreme cases for 10 years. But, this is just an excuse to not maintaining proper internal controls or internal records. So my sense is that this is not that big deal. Data maintenance is possible. All we have to do is we have to just start that habit of documenting the transaction in detail whenever it happens. So the 3 steps of a transaction, if it can be documented well and stored well, doesn't matter whether it is 2 years later or 3 years later. If anyone is reading, it should be transparent. So you have to have proper backups in your data bank to explain that transaction. Then whether it's an income tax officer or your own shareholders, your bankers, anyone can ask this information, right? So we shouldn't be concerned about that maintenance of data. That's my point of view.
Sure. The only thing on this count, unfortunately, in the role we play, what worries me the most when I see the reassessment provisions is how do you understand the threshold which will trigger a reassessment today? Because you really have you had established judicial precedents on what will constitute reason to believe, and now the dilution seems to be that all that the AO has to do, that he has to have evidence that suggests to him that income has escaped assessment. So what will formulate the basis of his suggestion, which I don't know if it is a sufficient and sufficiently strong threshold because, most practically in corporate tax cases, 50 lakhs is not a very high threshold.
Correct.
50 lakhs is a threshold you can breach in almost all corporate taxpayers in the country today.
Right.
I don't know. Those are things that worry me. But I guess it is the role I play as a tax advisor sometimes that makes me overthink it.
Yeah, so taking this discussion forward, I have a question for Lakshmi Shah. The reassessment process has been revamped, and now we are moving towards a digital stint on your assessment side in income tax. And there's a proposal now to include ITAT also. How do you think this will translate in terms of, for you as a not as a business, but generally as an industry? Do you think there will be a remarkable change going forward?
So I think from a faceless assessment or e-proceedings which have come up, I think most of it has come up in the last couple of years. And now moving everything immediately to an e-assessment, I think we could have waited for ITAT to move, probably given it a couple of more years for the taxpayer as well as the department to sort out and iron out issues that come up in the normal assessment proceedings and appeals, get adjusted to the whole process, and then move to the ITAT also on a e-assessment proceeding. Probably there could have been a pause of one more year before we skipped into that. But having said that, I think it's a welcome move because it reduces the time that is being taken, because if you look at ITAT, for anyone to get a hearing, it's minimum 4 years, unless it's some urgent matter which has been pending for several other cases and you get clubbed with someone. So I hope that the period reduces now and there is speedy disposal, because whenever you have to go for an appeal, it's either minimum 20% at CITA level that you have to deposit or 50% at ITAT level unless you get a stay on the demand. So this will hopefully speeden up the process, reduce the time taken for disposal of cases, and even in case you need to go to High Court or Supreme Court, probably this could speeden up where earlier it used to take 9 or 10 years. But from an overall process perspective, people are still learning. So hope to wait and watch and see what happens.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think we've sort of been in preparatory mode for a virtual stint. Though faceless, I don't know how far it will go, but virtual hearing, yes, we've been at it before the courts because of the lockdown. And once that stage was set, I think that this was probably the next step to have happened.
Acceleration of COVID, caused by COVID. No, I think this has been a very useful discussion. Before I sort of let the panel go, I'm very tempted to ask 15 seconds each, any non-tax takeaways, from a policy perspective, quick non-tax takeaways. Arun, would you like to go first?
One interesting aspect which came before the budget, there was mention of it in the budget as well, was the PLI, the incentive scheme that the government is announcing. It has been now left to respective ministries to formulate the programs. So that's one interesting space that I would wait and watch to see how this is going to work as a fillip to the economy, for the growth of the economy.
Great. Varun?
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing that stands out in the budget is the desire to have, have capital expenditure by the government. So government spending on capital expenditure with a desire to boost the economy. So the government has clearly chosen growth over fiscal discipline, which, in the backdrop of a pandemic where revenue expectations have fallen, there is lower economic activity, meets with the desire to kind of re-kickstart the economy. And coupled with this, they're looking at serious efforts to garner capital. There's been a slew of changes, even on attracting sovereign wealth funds and making that entire process, which has been in demand of that part of the industry, don't consider it as a commercial activity. If they appoint a director, let them invest into 50% AIFs, which have 50% investment into infrastructure facilities, etc. Putting up a DFI, debt funding of a host of infrastructure activities. I think that entire part of the budget is very heartwarming to say that this is how the government expects to take the economy to the next level.
Great. Sanjeev, quick thoughts?
Yes. So for me, the growth forecast of 11% for financial year 21-22 requires a solid roadmap. And we have to see if this still have strong pillars to achieve the economic activity. So the budget 2021 actually creates, I would say, highway for this economic growth, and we have to see how it goes. Secondly, ease of doing business is very important. As someone has said, over regulations leads to more discretions. So
our economic survey acknowledges it today.
yeah, it was there.
Right.
That's what is my take on this.
Great. Lakshmisha, what's your thought?
I think one of the key takeaways for me was the stress on the infrastructure that has been laid out to make it a connected India in terms of the roads, the railways, and shipping and other things. That has been a big boost, which will hopefully have a ripple effect on the entire economy and then start moving the wheels in a much quicker way. One other thing which I would have wished to see in the budget, which had been announced sometime late last year during the COVID-related announcement, was listing of an Indian company directly overseas. I think this was something which was keenly being watched by everyone because quite a few companies do want to list to raise capital, give exit, get funding, but there's no rules to list directly overseas. So that's something which I hope they come up very soon, as they have announced, and look forward to that.
I would just add the aspect of cross-border mergers, right? Bringing in the tax certainty around that, because today you really don't have an exemption in the form that you have for any other mergers today. I think I would just add that to the list that you brought out. All right, with that, thank you everybody. Thank you from the panel for joining us on this very engaging discussion. We will now take public questions. The Q&A session will now start. But a quick, needless yet essential disclaimer, views and comments that are expressed on this webinar by each of our panelists are personal and do not represent the views of any organization. With that general note on a disclaimer on the views expressed here, we'll quickly take some questions. And, the first one that sort of caught my attention was an interesting question around variation in the timelines of reassessment. So to say that if a taxpayer disposes the records after 3 years, but a reassessment is then initiated because you have the up to 10-year permission, how do you deal with it? I'll modify the question a little bit though. And this is also part of my immediate concern. Let's suppose a notice is today issued. Let's suppose the law in the current form is enacted, the proposal in the current form is enacted, and a notice is issued by the tax officer going back to the 9th year or the 10th year. So we are in 2021. Let's say a reassessment is now being proposed for 2011 or 2012. Essentially, the 8-year period, which we are popularly used to for maintaining corporate records, that period is also statutorily, is sort of expired. And then for the 9th and 10th year, if a reassessment is done, how do we deal with it? I suppose one of the arguments that a taxpayer could take here was the impossibility of performance, because this is a change that will create some bit of a unique lacuna in terms of how it operates. So that bit of a argument around impossibility of performance, at least at the High Court level, we hope you will find merit. I'm not sure really in the revised procedures if the tax officer consider your reply, not even dispose of the basic requirement of natural principles of law, saying that dispose with permission, with the ability to hear you. All if he has to do is to consider your reply. I really don't know if at the first assessment level you will succeed. But most certainly the High Court level, I see a ray of hope, because there will be some benefit that will get extended to it. Quickly, any views from the panel on this?
Probably I'll go first on this. So yeah, you're right, Ritesh. So that's my thought as well. It's absolute bad luck unless there is one case which has a rippling effect for the previous years. That could be a scenario I can think of when it could be open for reassessment. Yes, considering most forms of records are now electronic, it is likely that both tax office and you would have the data in electronic form. If not, at least the tax office is going to have the electronic form, records on electronic form, given the state of compliance today. So so there could be an argument to take that legally you cannot extend it beyond 8 years since your records are not required to be maintained, but it is also a possibility that the records will be available with tax office and you might still have to give an effect to a court order or a proceeding which has a rippling effect for 8 years, beyond 8 years.
I think at some level, maybe there'll be some streamlining of provisions that will happen. And let's hope that happens in the coming months.
Because otherwise, this will be a new series of litigation around reassessments.
Yeah.
We've gone through one set for 40 years, and another 40 years will go understanding what this means. There's some questions around the startup ecosystem. Unfortunately, not much has been done to incentivize the startup ecosystem. There is some liberalization of the one-person company, the benefit of extending your tax holiday, etc. That has been done. I think that's the least that one would have done. But on this note, Lakshmisha, quick thing, any view, comment on how startups have been looked at in this budget?
I think it has been status quo. The welcome things were extending the tax holiday period as well as extending the ability to claim a deduction for selling house property and make investment in a startup for a promoter. Those two were welcome moves. But what was more being expected was a couple of things which I mentioned earlier. One, the ability to list an Indian company overseas directly. That was something which most startups were looking forward to, given the market sentiment and the overseas investors' interest into the startups for the main funders even today as we speak. So that was one which was widely expected. A couple of things that was being looked at was ease in compliance. Because if you look at it, I think from a corporate law perspective, from an employment law perspective, there was quite a lot of ease that was brought in the previous year by letting away some of the compliances to be done in the first 2 years of a startup and others. But nothing of that sort had come both for TDS as well as GST. So something over there was being expected for the limits to be increased and also for the complaints to be made either a semi-annual or an annual. Otherwise, I think the maintained status quo, which is also good instead of some retrospective changes or new changes coming in. Overall, I think it was a good budget from the startup ecosystem, except for if the listing would have come, I think that would have been icing on the cake for it.
Yeah, you're right. That would have been a big icing on the cake. So I guess I'm repeatedly being prompted for the time that I think we're hitting, or we may have slightly surpassed our estimated time. So with that, those questions from the public which have remained unaddressed, we will work with Economic Times and try and address them over emails to each one of you. I also see some questions from anonymous users. I'm not sure how we'll be able to reach you, but we'll try our best with the Economic Times team to sort of help reach out and sort of give you our responses. So with that, I guess that's a wrap on today evening's discussion on the Union Budget 2021. Once again, thank you all. Thank you, Arun, Varun, Lakshmisha, and Sanjeev.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining this panel and enlightening us, giving us your practical experience as industry tax leaders on how these changes will affect and will have to be implemented. Thank you once again. Thank you, Economic Times, for hosting us. Thank you.